We are incredibly honored to welcome our third panel of the day, Society in Flux, exploring Iran's social movements and women's rights. We are pleased to have Dr. Dayerizadeh moderate this panel. Dr. Dayerizadeh serves as an assistant director for education abroad, as well as adjunct faculty across various departments, including the School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies, Women's and Gender Studies, and the Judy Ginshaft Honors College at the University of South Florida. Dr. Dayerizadeh completed her doctorate in government within the School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies at USF, focusing her research on women and negotiating gender norms within Shia Muslim communities in the United States. I will now turn the discussion over to Dr. Dayerizadeh, who will introduce the panelists, facilitate the discussion, and lead the Q&A session that follows.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Great, because I usually have a very loud voice. I don't even need this, but for you all to hear me, I'm going to make sure that I speak into this. So thank you very much to everyone who has organized this panel discussion today, this conference. Thank you to Dr. Milani. Thank you to General McKenzie. Thank you to Heather and her whole team here. I know how much work it takes to organize a conference, so I hope you all are breathing soon. We're almost done, but we are the last panel for today. Congratulations on making it to the end. And thank you to my panelists here who hopefully have the energy to go through this next 90 minutes of discussion on women in Iran and social movements. So Iran has a rich history of social movements and activism. It has not just started recently. If you have just tuned into the Women Life Freedom Movement and consider that this is a social movement in Iran as the sole social movement that you know of, well, no. It's been over 100 years of movements, and Iranians actually have a culture of activism, and everyone thinks they're political and have something to say about politics, and I mean everyone. So Iranian women have always been involved in social movements in Iran, pre-revolution, during the revolution, and after the revolution. Iranian women have actively participated in leftist movements, in movements of nationalism, in conservative and religious movements, in the reformist movements, as well as liberal movements. In particular, since the Green Movement of 2009, which contested the elections of former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, until the Women Life Movement of today, you see women in Iran front and center of these movements. Iranian women put their bodies on the line every day. And for our discussion today, we're going to look at the circumstances of women in Iran that are changing every day. We're going to look at the situation of women, and then we're going to also look at the regime's response to recent protests. So I would love to introduce my panelists to the left. Commander Nicole Cale grew up in the Midwest and has a Bachelor's of Science in Biochemistry from Indiana University and a master's degree in Strategic Studies from the U.S. Army War College. After her undergraduate degree, Commander Cale was commissioned in the Navy and later served in multiple positions, before transitioning over to Selective Reserves, where she has primarily served as a Special Operations Planner at Special Operations Command Central. And now, currently with Special Operations Command, her role is the J2 prior to launch Counter Small Unarmed Aerial Systems Division's Plans Chief. She is also the J51 Lead Iran Threat Network Strategist and Planner. She is a fully joint qualified officer. Welcome, Commander, and thank you for leading our discussion today. And to the left of Commander Cale is Dr. Is Ms. Negar Mortazavi. Ms. Mortazavi is an award-winning journalist, senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, and a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Policy Council in Washington. She is the editor and host of the Iran podcast. If you haven't listened, I highly recommend tuning in. And a political commentator for national and international media outlets, including CNN, MSNBC, NPR, BBC, Al Jazeera, and others. Her work has been published by Foreign Policy Magazine, Political, and The Intercept. Ms. Mortazavi has been covering Iranian politics and society for over a decade. Mortazavi has been featured in Forbes among 30 inspirational women who are breaking boundaries. She has been named by Middle East Policy Council among 40 young leaders shaping the present and future of U.S.-Middle East relations, and among 40 Iranian American young leaders who have made an enormous impact on their community and country. Ms. Mortazavi received her master's degree in international development from Brandeis University and her bachelor's of arts from the University of Massachusetts. And then to the left of Ms. Mortazavi is Dr. Emily Blout. She is a media scholar and historian whose research focuses on propaganda, information operations, media manipulation by state and non-state actors. She is author of Media and Power in Modern Iran, Mass Communications, Ideology, and the State. Dr. Blout is a senior research fellow at the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism and visiting professor at the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy, and Strategy at Reichman University in Israel. She teaches courses on anti-Semitism, terrorism, and propaganda at the Center for Jewish Civilization at Georgetown University. She holds a PhD in Iranian Studies from the University of St. Andrews and a master's in Security Studies from the National Defense University. Dr. Blout served as a fellow at the Pentagon in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for National Security Affairs. She has worked at the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University, where she researched WMD, nonproliferation, and counterterrorism policymaking at the National Security Council. She has also served as a legislative director of a leading nonprofit organization representing Americans of Iranian descent. Thank you all for being here. What we're going to do is have our presenters each speak for 15 minutes, and then I will ask a few questions, and then we will open it up for questions from the audience. So jot down your questions, and I will hand over my privilege of speaking over to...
Thank you so much for having me here. I am truly grateful to be here today, and I appreciate the kind introduction. I do have some slides that will provide more detail and context to a portion of the content that I will cover, but I will not be reading these slides out to you for the sake of time. Also, even if you know all this information already, it does provide a better alternate than looking at a picture of my face, so there's that. The burden that I have at the moment is to capture the consistently tremendous courage and grit of a population enduring relentless suffering. I would like to start off by clarifying that when you talk about Iran, you must take care to distinguish between the regime and the Iranian population. We live in a country with a government that is representative, so we don't automatically make that separation. And Iran's government, which I will refer to as the regime from here on, is a state sponsor of terrorism since 1979 at the expense of the population. The makeup of the regime is geriatric, fanatical Shia men that do not represent the Iranian population or their beliefs. The regime is headed up by a supreme leader whose top priority is regime survival, and the supreme leader and his extremist clerics essentially handpick presidential candidates, so elections in Iran are not free, fair, and representative. The supreme leader retains the power in decision-making with no accountability as the self-professed representative of God on earth. And Iran's president is held accountable as a scapegoat, but lacks power. The other panels covered the regime's plethora of well-established external malign behaviors, making it a cancer to the region. But as Tampa Bay's Billy Mays used to say, but wait, there's more. Internally, the regime focuses on enforcing gender apartheid, forcing an extremist interpretation of the Shia religion on a population via horrific human rights violations, controlling state media, which spews propaganda, sabotaging and filtering the internet, imprisoning opposition, and plundering the wealth of the nation through a command economy. Gender apartheid has always been a key regime pillar. In 1979, the Supreme Leader's first acts were to repeal hard-earned rights and protections for women and girls under the law and to actively enforce their subjugation and oppression. In Iran, 9-year-old girls are legally considered women and have to wear the hijab. And oftentimes, they have to wear it at even younger ages according to their school requirements. Starting at age 9, they also have to wear trousers, full tunics, full clothing to swim. Marriage age for girls is only 13. A woman's testimony is considered half of a man's, and women must get permission from their husbands to get a passport, travel, work. Girls and women cannot ride bicycles, sing, dance, or attend sporting events. Girls and women do not have equal protection under the law from discrimination, violence, or family issues like divorce, custody matters, inheritance. The Supreme Leader banned contraceptives. State-sanctioned atrocities are committed against women and girls. The morality police are paid by the regime to harass, detain, arrest, beat, torture, rape, and even kill women and girls as they see fit. The Iranian population is younger, educated, secularized, and generally more Western-leaning in their views than their Arab neighbors, and certainly the regime. Almost 9% of the population identifies as atheist. 22% deny following any organized religion, and only 40% even categorize themselves as Muslim. Iranians don't support mandatory hijab, and the majority wants a government that is secular and representative. But before we dive into the recent social movement known as Woman Life Freedom that garnered both international and US press attention, I want to first make the point that Iran has a long history of protests and social movements, like you also said, ma'am. I have a sampling of these on the slides for you. The Iranian population has enjoyed some success in using protests as an agent for change, especially prior to 1979. But since 1979, courageous Iranians have conducted many protests and social movements for women's rights, fair elections, a better economy, and reform, causes that they hold to be greater than themselves. And the tone-deaf regime responds with crackdowns and purging oppositions, journalists, scholars, artists, citizens with leadership skills, and citizens that tell the truth. Iranians have a penchant for protesting. There's patterns we can identify. And after the regime murders a citizen, the cultural 40 days of mourning morphs into protests. Anniversaries of these murders, the New Year's holiday, and elections tend to look a lot like civil resistance. Regime crackdowns beget more uprisings. And in panels earlier today, there was talk of JCPOA. And when the US pulled out of JCPOA, the US used the economic instrument of national power with the maximum pressure campaign, the centerpiece of which was, at the time, the most robust sanctions package against any country in the world in the history of forever. And then COVID-19 amplified the impact of these sanctions. And one shorter-term goal behind these sanctions is to reduce the funding available for malign behaviors like the terrorism, the nuclear program. But another goal is to improve the regime's behavior, as there's a process for sanctions to be repealed when the offender demonstrates acceptable behavior. Yet the regime digs in, pressing on at the expense of the population. The regime uses illicit markets, other rogue states to fund malign activities and line their own pockets. Meanwhile, domestically, their currency's in free fall with hyperinflation, high unemployment, food insecurity, water scarcity, power outages, crisis in healthcare, mismanagement of public health, and a middle class that is dwindling with skyrocketing poverty. The regime and IRGC publicly steal the wealth and resources of the country. Businesses and entire sectors of the economy are owned and operated by the regime and IRGC. Corruption and mismanagement is normal steady state in Iran. And not only does the regime refuse to solve these problems, the regime wastes resources on morality police, propaganda, degrading the internet, and mobile networks, which further harms morale. And with all this in the background, the population is fed up and no longer demanding mere reforms. They demand a better future without the regime. And I want to engender with the slides and my remarks an appreciation that the Woman Life Freedom movement did not occur in some kind of civil resistance vacuum. Women have been protesting the hijab and their treatment since the regime's beginning. The population has protested for reform in the past, and instead of addressing their ever-growing grievances, the regime doubles down with increased degradation. And it's helpful to see these movements as a continuous larger effort where a given movement informs the next. So instead of just deciding that the Woman Life Freedom movement failed because protests died down without regime change, please consider that this movement is a pivot point which will influence the next movement, which is no doubt coming. Gina Masha Amini was a healthy 22-year-old woman who had just been admitted to university with the goal of becoming a doctor. Her family and friends described her as shy, reserved, and not involved in anything activist or political. And in Iran, if you aren't ethnic Persian and Farsi-speaking and Shia, you're part of a minority group, you will face additional discrimination and struggles. And she belonged to a marginalized group, the Kurds, and hailed from Kurdistan province in northwestern Iran. On September 13th of 22, she traveled to Tehran and was arrested by the morality police in front of her brother, and she was wearing the required hijab and minding her own business. And her brother was told she would be taken to a detention center for an hour-long class and then released. And instead, she was beaten and taken to a hospital where it would take her days to die from the injuries inflicted on her by these regime thugs. She passed September 16th, a few days shy of her 23rd birthday. The regime did not hold the morality police accountable, and they put out a ridiculous cover-up narrative that she coincidentally died in custody due to fatal pre-existing medical problems. But this is one of the reasons I love Iranians. Her family bravely disclosed the truth about her unremarkable medical history, and brave eyewitnesses came forth giving accounts of her beatings, and her leaked autopsy reports exposed her torture, and brave journalists told the truth. Her senseless death immediately became a symbol of contempt for the regime. There was nothing wrong with what she was wearing or doing at the time under the regime's rules. Her death and the regime's response upset broad swaths of the population from any religious background. Religious women who choose to wear the hijab were alarmed because she dressed like they do. And men also were alarmed to think that their moms, wives, sisters, daughters would be the next ones to die arbitrarily and capriciously at the hands of unrestrained morality police. News of Amini's death spread quickly via social media, and her funeral and 40 days mourning became protests, first in her hometown. They chanted "Woman, Life, Freedom," which is an established Kurdish slogan. And I first remember hearing the Kurds chant "Woman, Life, Freedom" to stand up to ISIS, Daesh, many years ago. Regime security fired tear gas at the mourners as protests quickly spread to the regional capital. And demonstrations occurred throughout all of Iran, despite the regime's efforts, including internet network disruptions, mass arrests, tear gas, disappearances, civilian blindings, killings to squash them. In fact, these regime activities spurred more protests. And protesters shouted death to the dictator, calling for regime change, and women were removing their headscarves and dangling them from sticks and setting them on fire. And to be very clear, these acts are not meant to show contempt for religion, nor show contempt for those that choose to wear it or any religious garb. Women that choose to wear the hijab also joined the protests. The hijab is a potent symbol of oppression in Iran, and refusing to wear it is an act of defiance against the regime, 44 years in the making. Women are cutting their hair, which culturally demonstrates grief, despair, and also messages, "I sever your politics and religion from my body." Women and girls sing and dance and ride bikes and try to get into sporting events, and they document it, hoping it will go viral to defy the regime. And by this defiance, they say, "I want agency, self-determination, women's rights, and to choose which religion I practice. I want a secular government that represents me, so I have the freedom to live my life on my own terms." And we see Iranian men en masse publicly supporting women, intrinsically understanding and cognitively linking women's rights to the life they want for their future under a free Iran. And the protests over one young woman's death in regime custody became a flashpoint to change the future of Iranian society, because all their movements and grievances have built on each other over decades. And for Iranians, women's issues are not their only complaints, but this fight has enabled them to connect gender-based violence and apartheid to the regime's other authoritarian behaviors and corruption. And the lyrics from Blout perhaps capture this best, because this song is collectively authored by the population, so it's their own words. And this power ballad is the anthem of the Woman Life Freedom movement. A 25-year-old essentially crowdsourced these lyrics. In his music video, he displays tweets from the population and diaspora, and like many others, he was predictably arrested and tortured. But his song also went viral, and he won a Grammy in 2023. I encourage you to look up and listen to this song if you haven't already, just so that you get the full experience by feeling the music and not just reading translated lyrics. Everybody needs a song on their playlist that gives you goosebumps, and this song always does for me. Next, I want to address what makes this movement unique. It was led by women and Gen Z girls, very inclusive, unifying both sexes, people of all ages, backgrounds, professions, education levels, under the same banner. And it lacked a single leader and clearly called for regime change. Protesters, Gen Z girls in particular, did a phenomenal job uploading content on platforms like TikTok so that their words, deeds, images would go viral. The diaspora connected to and supported the internal population profoundly over social media, and protests played out on the world stage in near real time. Even other women living under gender apartheid in Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia were reached and inspired despite ethnic, cultural, religious, and language differences. And if you're like me and you work in national security, you are familiar with a topic known as women in peacekeeping and security. And if you're not familiar with it, the idea is that when a state is transitioning from war or conflict to peace or stability, you really want women to have a meaningful participation in that process. And one reason is that women tend to surface women's issues, but another reason is that the stability initiative, the peace agreement, the treaty, it's actually more likely to have greater success and for longer when women get involved. And the thought behind this is that women and men have slight differences in the way that we see things, do things, and leverage placement and relationships in society. And because women are half the population, these differences create a real impact, and because women and men have a way of complementing each other, that outcome trends positive. And I see parallels in women in peacekeeping and security and women in civil resistance. High levels of female participation tend to make civil resistance efforts more inclusive, innovative, nonviolent, and successful. The protests occurred in over 138 cities, including areas once considered regime strongholds. And while the protests continue to center on the rights and demands of women, their calls for change are being echoed by larger cross-sections of the population than ever before. And while there are other grievances at play, their opposition to the regime is shared. And this is one of the first times we have seen men also join in that call and support Iranian women. And we are seeing that women's interests and their demands fall in line with the larger pro-democratic, pro-human rights demands that the larger society has. And the diversity of the demonstrators is a direct consequence of the frontline participation of women. And movements that showcase many women are also more likely to employ creative, peaceful methods, such as removing the head coverings, cutting hair, riding bikes, singing, dancing, with the more conventional methods, such as protests and boycotts and strikes. And women-led movements tend to be more difficult to suppress with brute force because it draws harsher condemnation and unwanted attention. And the protests endured for the better part of a year, and it's no coincidence that the 500-plus protester deaths at the hands of the regime are mostly young men. Movements that heavily feature women are generally more likely to lead to defections among both members and supporters of a regime, in part because women just garner more legitimacy and sympathy for their movements. And high levels of female participation give pro-democracy movements a higher chance of success and predicts a greater outcome for all people groups seeking increased rights and freedoms. However, we also know that when movements do not achieve their ultimate objective, and there's been extensive female participation, there's almost always a regression in gender equality and democracy. And we're seeing this right now in Iran. While rumors of divisions among lawmakers over the violent crackdowns do surface, it would seem that the regime is fairly unified, at least publicly and at least for now. The regime has doubled down on its position, refusing to enact reforms, claiming that the protests are a Western plot, and becoming more repressive. So far, regime components like the IRGC, Basij, the police, the intelligence offices, the judiciary, they demonstrate enough unity and capacity to suppress dissent with harsher tactics, particularly against girls and women. Hundreds of Gen Z girls were poisoned with chemicals at school. There is an uptick in hijab enforcement, including using more surveillance technology such as facial recognition. The regime is shutting down businesses that permit unveiled women and girls. And a new bill equates bad hijab to public nudity, conferring 10-year prison sentences. There are gross human rights violations, including arrests of 20,000 people, blindings with birdshot, amputations, skyrocketing executions. There's torture, forced confessions, rape, enforced disappearances, and increased propaganda and cover-ups. There's increased female persecution intersected with discrimination based on ethnicity and religion, disproportionately impacting women, children, and minorities. The regime filters and controls internet speed and accessibility. Social media platforms and millions of sites are banned. VPNs, which were widely used to circumvent the regime firewall, are now illegal. The regime slows or shuts down the internet strategically to keep protesters from organizing, communicating, and posting. And the regime targets the Iranian diaspora with cyber attacks to tamper with their foreign activism, threatens them, and mistreats their families still living in Iran. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to learning from the other panelists.
Thank you, Commander. Next, we'll have Ms. Mortazavi.
Thank you so much to GNSI, University of South Florida, General Mackenzie, Dr. Milani, his team for inviting us here, for hosting this very timely event, and thank you all for staying for the last panel of the day. I promise to be brief, in part because Commander Nicole, if I may, covered a lot of what I was planning to say, which is great, about the Masa Amini movement. So I'll just try to be short and then have more time for Q&A, or also for you, Emily. So first, Raheleh asked me to talk about the 2022 protest, the Women Life Freedom protest, or the Masa Amini protest, as you mentioned, following the death in custody, or essentially killing, of this young Kurdish woman, small town girl who happened to be in the wrong place, wrong time, arrested by the morality police, taken to custody, goes into a coma, eventually dies. Family under a lot of pressure to say that she had underlying health conditions. Nevertheless, her funeral turns into a mass protest in her region of Kurdistan in western Iran, and then essentially the protests spread to dozens of cities and towns across the country. Women and girls leading essentially this uprising, what I saw as a feminist uprising, but also with allies and intersectional community of protesters, each bringing their own grievances, political, economic, social, even cultural, to the streets, and with slogans that were not limited to women life freedom, turned very radical at some point, essentially addressing the core of the regime, top leadership, and demanding fundamental change. The protests lasted for a few months. Their state, essentially security forces, used a lot of violence, brutal violence, essentially an iron fist, to crack down the protests, or wrap it up, as they say. Hundreds killed on the streets, thousands arrested, some executed, some more on the death row. There's constant threats that there will be more in punishment, and essentially the protesters were sort of sent back home. Nevertheless, I don't think the protests failed. Yes, some thought back then that this was going to bring an imminent fall of the regime. There was many activists referred to it as a revolution, and there was a lot of hope, I think, inside and outside, that this would be the end of the Islamic Republic. That didn't happen. I actually agree with how General Mackenzie earlier sort of the framing of, I actually wrote it down here, that the protesters were not capable of moving the center of gravity in Iran. And I agree with that from a political sense. No, the monopoly of power, violence, the arms, is all, essentially it belongs to the state. And the state has increasingly been showing that they're willing and capable to use more violence, more sort of repressive methods to crack down on these protests or wrap them up, as they say, as soon as possible. This didn't just happen in 2022. This also happened in the previous round of mass protests, 2019. Before that, 2009. Before that, the student protests of 1999, the Kuye Daneshgah. But every time we see that the crackdown gets more repressive, more violent, more deaths or killings on the street, more arrests, and all of that. And this one, I would say the Mahsa Amini protests, at least the number of arrests was unprecedented compared to previous protests. And these are also all numbers that have been documented by human rights organizations, mostly outside the country. So they're with a caveat of at least this many have been killed, at least this many have been. But I think what we see today in Iran and what continues sort of as the legacy of the Mahsa Amini protests, and I think you made a great point about religious women. I want to highlight this, not just religious women, but religious communities, is that a lot of them see themselves in Mahsa Amini. A lot of men saw or still see their own sisters in Mahsa Amini. In fact, when Mahsa Amini was picked up by the so-called morality police, and for those of you who don't know, the morality police are literally Gashte Ershad, the guidance patrol, is tasked as part of the Iranian police system, is tasked with enforcing not just the mandatory dress code, but essentially for women and men, by the way, mostly the mandatory dress code, but chastity and sort of how you appear in public among the Iranian within the society. And it's really turned into a force of public harassment, using a lot of violence against women. And Mahsa Amini wasn't the only case, actually. There was a lead up to Mahsa Amini before her. A few months before that, there was a video that went viral of a mother who was pushing the police van of this morality police, saying, "Please don't take my daughter. Her daughter is arrested inside the van. Please don't take my daughter. She's sick." Nevertheless, they take her. The van drives away. The mother is pushed to the side of the street. That generated a lot of anger in the society. After that, there was a case of a young woman, Sepide Rashno, who was confronted not by the morality police, but seemed like a private citizen. There was a little argument about hijab in a bus. This private citizen took it upon herself to tell her to observe the compulsory hijab, and an argument ensues. And finally, this young woman gets picked up by the intelligence forces and is brought to television for a first confession of her mistakes and scenes and things like that. That generated a lot of anger a few months after the case of the mother. And then with Mahsa Amini, essentially, you come to a watershed moment where women and girls who have been fighting this mandatory dress code for 40 years, since the beginning that it was imposed, are basically saying enough is enough. I mean, there's violence, there's beatings, there's that, but now you're gonna kill us for how we dress. And look at how Mahsa Amini was dressed. There are actually videos of her in detention, so we know exactly how she looked like when she was arrested. And to the majority of the Iranian society, she looked very normal. In fact, a lot of, as you said, religious women do dress like that. So, and her brother, when she was picked up, going back to my point, her brother was the one arguing with this morality police. Why are you taking my sister? You know, she does this, she didn't, whatever the exact quotes were. But he tried to stop the arrest. He couldn't. Nevertheless, they took her. So one of the reasons men joined these protests, this essentially feminist uprising for women's dress code, is because they saw themselves in the brother of Mahsa Amini. They saw their own sisters in Mahsa Amini, their own daughters in Mahsa Amini, some even their own mothers in Mahsa Amini. And they'd be like, this is something that could happen to my daughter, my sister, anytime, and just enough is enough. So I think we got a sense of that, and then all these other grievances that were brought onto the street that have been building up also, these grievances over years within Iran. So none of these are new, and they're not addressed by the state every time there's mass protests. So in 2019, immediately before the Mahsa Amini protests or the Women Life Freedom protest, in 2019, protests broke out after the government suddenly hiked fuel prices overnight, and protests broke out. So essentially for an economic reason, but again, they turned very political, very radical. Again, the state used an iron fist to crack down on those protests. And in fact, the numbers recorded back then by Human Rights Organization of those who were killed by security forces was even higher than this one. And then before that, 2009, around the presidential election, the famous Green Movement, which actually in terms of numbers of people who would be on the street at any given moment was the largest, the most serious. There were at some point a couple of million, if not more, people protesting in Tehran. That took the longest. Those protests took close to a year. In 2009, it was the most serious threat to the Islamic Republic since the 1979 revolution. But again, it was cracked down. But so speaking a little more or sort of expanding on that point that General McKenzie also mentioned, I think these protests, or sort of the sense of the society, is that, or that what the regime also understands, is that they're dealing with a very serious legitimacy crisis, meaning that they know and they understand that a big portion of the population, and honestly polling in Iran is very difficult. I think the polls you used were done from outside. It's very hard to get accurate numbers. It's very securitized, politicized. So we don't have, I don't have exact numbers, but we know that a good portion of the society does not like how the country is being governed, and in a political, economic, social sense. But did that translate into an existential crisis for the regime? I don't think so. And I also agree with, I believe it was the current CIA head, Ambassador Burns, who also at some point did say that U.S. intelligence does not show that these protests pose a threat, an existential threat, or a regime change threat. So again, as I said, the monopoly of force, of violence has been within the state. Let's also not forget that this is a state that has supported their friend, which was mentioned earlier, Bashar Assad in Syria, who has endured a revolution, uprising, years of civil war, and nevertheless he's still in power and has just been integrated into at least part of the region. So looking at this from a political sense, or putting that political sense aside, I nevertheless think that the Women Life Freedom movement, which built on 40 years of resistance, did bring a massive cultural change. I would even call it a cultural revolution, because it's just been so different. I speak to a lot of sources, friends and family who live in the country. I can't go back. I live in exile, but I'm in touch with a lot of people inside. And what they describe of how much women and girls are now defying this mandatory hijab, which is the most visible symbol. And it's not just the hijab. This extent to discrimination and laws in family, marriage, divorce, child custody, work, travel, you name it, whatever has to do with women and men, there is some form of discrimination. But this dress code is just something that women deal with on a daily basis. And they've been defying it for 40 years. But since the protests of the 2022, the change has just been massive. There has been essentially a genie came out of the bottle during those protests. That's just so hard. The state is trying to put it back in. It's like, I call it a broken dam, where a lot of water is going through and they're trying to put it back as the water is going through. It's just impossible. The genie, I don't think, can go back into the bottle. And there's a lot of defiance. And what women and young girls tell me and many other journalists is that when you see other women and girls also defying this rule or this law, that gives you more courage, and it's kind of contagious. And it just sort of creates that cycle or perpetuates itself. So yes, there is more crackdown. The state is trying all these alternative, they think clever methods of trying to reinforce the mandatory hijab. At some point, they said the morality police is no longer there. In fact, they were not seen on the streets by many immediately following those protests. But now they're using facial recognition. They're using citizen reporting. You can literally report your fellow citizen if someone is driving without a hijab. They would get through the car information. They would later get a alert and would have to sort of like bring their car, pay a fee, and promise to not drive without a hijab again. So there's all kinds of ways businesses are being closed or threatened. If you're a government employee or employee of a bank, of any system that the state has some form of control, they're trying to pressure. But I don't think, going back to the point, I don't think the genie can be put back into the bottle. And nevertheless, I think that massive cultural change has really happened. And one of the other slogans of the protests, first it was Woman, Life, Freedom. The other one that was written also on Mahsa Amini's grave was that it says, Gina, which is her Kurdish name, Gina, your death, you didn't die, your name became a code word. So I think it wasn't for nothing. I don't think those protests really failed completely. Yes, they didn't bring that kind of revolution or regime change that some were hoping for. But I think that that watershed moment created a massive jump in a cultural and social sense that would normally take maybe a couple of decades. So the slow move that we've witnessed in 40 years suddenly was accelerated in the past now almost 2 years. I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take questions later. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Mortazavi. Thank you. And now we're going to look at everything happening from the state level, from the regime level, bird's eye view. Dr. Blout.
Great. All right. First, I want to acknowledge that I have now learned for the first time in the Global National Security Institute's history, we have an all-woman panel. And I have to say that is a testament to the vision, the leadership, and the wisdom of the people who put this on today, and specifically Professor Milani and Heather Ward, who really brought this thing together, and of course of the general. So thank you to them, very wise. We've talked about social movements from the perspective of the people. I want to do the flip side and talk about it from the perspective of the regime, and specifically focusing today on the internet. So here's the game plan. I want to look at the developments of the internet capabilities and infrastructure over 3 inflection points and 3 protests. So 2009, 2018, and 19, I'm putting those together, and then of course 2022. So before I do that, I want to share my new book, which is called Media and Power in Modern Iran. It came out last year, but that doesn't mean you don't have to buy it now. I will apologize. I encourage you to purchase it, but I do apologize for the cost of this book, over $100. So you can easily get it in a digital version, way cheaper, or even wait for the paperback to come out later this year. So the basic premise, the problem of my book, you can go back 1 second, is really, for our purposes, is really what explains the regime's staying power. We know from these conversations and Negar that the regime right now lacks key pillars of legitimacy. It lacks legitimacy through the rule of law. It lacks legitimacy through religion. So what else is standing up this regime? Well, one is obviously brute force, right? A monopoly on violence. And the other I'm interested in is media, and specifically the ability of the regime to project consent, mass consent, or at least not mass dissent. So right now we're going to go through those 3 inflection points I talked about, and we'll look at regime tactics during and after, and then we'll come back to this idea of legitimacy and consent. All right, 2009. Thank you for laying the ground here. We all now know what happened in 2009. And I would just say, hundreds, thousands, even millions of people coming out to urban centers, young people mostly, very excited about the elections, really excited about the reformist candidates, and really, really upset when the election was stolen and the incumbent president was reelected. Massive fraud. In the days after the announcement of the president winning the ballot, and actually I would just say before the polls were closed, it was announced that he was the winner, there were protests, and people were demanding enfranchisement. They were demanding, where's my vote? They just wanted to see the government respond to and give a good response to what they saw as fraud and their own disenfranchisement. So this happened for about a week, these really jubilant protests. They were on the streets, mainly urban centers, and it was largely peaceful. At the end of that week, the supreme leader comes to the pulpit and he says, all right, I hear you, you protest, enough and it's enough, and now we're gonna have the state to crack down. Wasn't that explicit, but basically he gave the green light for the regime, the security apparatus, police apparatus, to crack down violently on protesters, and that's what they did. So we can go into, and they've mentioned, the violence perpetrated on these protesters, again, very largely peaceful, but the regime has a problem, and the problem is this. People were recording the brutality of this regime on their phones. Pictures, videos, and these records of this brutality, this horrendous brutality, was getting out to the international community. People were emailing them, they're using social media, posting about them. And that was a big problem. And so this was really a learning, a point of learning and point of informing the regime in their next steps. They started to understand that we need to be able to control the narrative, and we need to instigate more repressive measures. I have now put here, it's kind of a menu of the ways that the regime used the internet and digitally enabled tactics to repress, the peaceful display of dissent. I'm not going to read those through, but I want to actually go down to, at the end here, with the forced television confessions, show trials, house arrest of the reformist leaders, and later President Khatami, who was the titular head of the reform movement, his image, likeness, and reportage of him was banned completely from the media. And that says something. You can go to the next one. So what happens after this? I said that there was learning during, now there's learning after. The regime and kind of goes on a rampage, really. It rallies about 40,000 people, it says, soft warriors, to go to the internet and revise the historical record about what happened. And so instead of presenting the reality of what happened, this was an organic movement in response and in dissent of the regime and its regime's actions, this was an act of outside powers. This was soft war. This was the responsibility of America, Israel, Great Satan and Little Satan, and it did not have to do with any kind of resistance from within. These are key institutions that were created afterwards. I do not have my glasses, so I'm not going to be able to read them out. I'll try, though. I actually need to mention Stuxnet, which many of you probably are aware of. This was like the super virus. It was an incredibly complex, sophisticated malware created by the US and Israel to disrupt the Iranian nuclear program, and it did wonders. It set the nuclear program back many years, but there was learning there also. Iran understood that they needed to create more security apparatuses to its arsenal, cut off their network from the regular worldwide network, and other things. And so now coming down here, I want to also just point out one of the learnings, and this is a learning from 2009 and the experience here. As I said, massive protests, big problem with the protests is images are getting out. So this started informing this thinking of, look, we need a way to contain this. We need a way to suppress dissent, suppress these protests, but also to contain information going out. We need to control this. And so this is where this idea for a national internet comes into play. And there actually was, my research shows that there was actually a program allocated money to a national internet. But so this basically breathes new life into that project. And that project is called the National Information Network, NIM or SHOMA. No. I just also, so let me just actually talk about that really quickly. So at this point, 2009, actually, I found in my research, no one talks about this because I found it, Iranian leadership actually had the ability to shut down the internet. It had the ability to do those things that it's thinking about later in this development. It had the technical capacity. There was all of the network was connected through one single node, the Telecommunications Agency of Iran. So it could do it technically, and my research shows that there's a good possibility, I'm not going to tell you 100%, that there was actually a decision made not to shut it down. Why wouldn't you shut it down? Two big reasons. One, the damage to the economy. At this point, Iran, like everywhere else, is relying on the internet for business. The damage to the government itself, cut down the internet, turn off everything, you can't communicate among agencies. That's one big bucket. The other big bucket is this. It's the image that would project to the world. At this time, Iran is really cognizant of its image to the world. It cares about public opinion. It cares about its standing in the international community. And so to shut down the internet completely puts Iran in the category of every other authoritarian state. And at this point, the semblance of democracy and legitimacy was up top on the agenda. And so that's why they didn't do that. You can go to the next one. So as kind of reaction to 2009, this impetus and information gleaned by 2009, we saw the project for the national internet to go full steam. This was led by Rouhani. He did, to his credit, a huge amount to create high-speed internet, to widen accessibility, to speed the tech economy. And just, technically, you need to put a lot of these things into place. You need to put in place, a number of components like boosting internet speed, right? He boosted internet speed from 127 kilowatts to 1.2 gigabytes. That's huge, okay? He also expanded the telecommunication infrastructure, so the networks, the bodies and the places around the nation, and the transmission layer where he laid actually 30,000 kilometers of fiber optic cable. So props to him. And this was also not just a campaign pledge, a realization of something that benefits everyone, a tech economy, better interconnectivity, but it's also supported the project for a national internet. And as you guys probably can tell by now, the big problem, the big mission of NIN wasn't just have a great time in Iran, have a lot of accessibility, live like everyone else lives. It was also control the population and be able to cut off connectivity when it wants to. All right, now fast forward to 2018 and 2019, and forgive me, I'm putting these two in two buckets. Really quickly, 2018, both of the protests here are economically driven, fundamentally. 2018 is interesting to me. 2018 was actually countrywide protests in response to the rapid rise in the prices of bread and chicken and basic foodstuffs. It was, unlike 2009, it was not limited to the urban centers. And unlike 2009, it was among the workers, among the people who are usually the supporters of the regime and hardline factions specifically. Now fast forward to 2019. Economic protests once again. This time it's, as Negar talked about, the rapid rise overnight of the price of oil. And this time, I would argue, they're a little bit more serious. Now we're seeing violence. We're seeing vandalism, right? We're seeing open calls for the demise of the regime. open calls for the demise of the supreme leader. This is something unimagined, okay? And all this information, all this news is getting circulated through social media, and specifically Telegram and Instagram. So something interesting happens in 2018, and this is it kind of connects you to 2019. In 2018, news was spreading about the protests, and there was one specific channel then, you might remember, it's Ahmed News. It was one Telegram channel, about 1 million subscribers, and it was circulating content that was really inciting. And that's what the regime said. It called out this channel, it demanded it be shut down, and Telegram obliged. But the regime, always capitalizing on opportunities here, used this as an opportunity to declare the ban on Telegram and Instagram completely. As you can imagine, nearly half the population was on Telegram, using it every day for business, for your life. And so people were obviously mad, disenfranchised, and actually suffered, but still, the government enacted this ban. The big thing, again, that I find in my book is that this had another impact, and there was another objective behind it. And the objective was this: the national internet, again, this big censorship machine, one of the requirements for functioning intranet, actually, is that you need content. You need content and you need users. So there was a forced migration. You can go to the next one. It was a forced migration of Telegram users onto the national internet, onto domestically hosted and created apps like Soroush and iGap, where the government can better surveil the text and intercourse. Now let's go to 2019. The big thing about 2019 you need to know is that where NIN was kind of tested and refined in 2018, 2019 is the show. This is the real thing. NIN at its best. Right? And what happened was that the Iranian government was able to entirely shut down the internet, Iran's access to the international internet, I'm going to call it the World Wide Web, for 1 week. Never seen this in history. This is massive. This is huge. But that shutdown, it wasn't a shutdown of the internet. It wasn't the blackout that the regime tried to avoid in 2009. It was just the severing, I'm being really simplistic here, of the connectivity and the communication between Iranians inside the country and everyone else. So, whereas in 2009, you were afraid of the economic and, just basically functional downsides of cutting off the net and turning it off, this time you had a functioning intranet and you had functioning government services, banking, and communications. You can even, Iran has its own ride-hailing app. That was functional. You can go to the next one. I think we kind of talked about this. So afterwards, learning from these two things, again, Iran's establishment's always learning tactically. There was new legal measures implemented. Of course, we talked about the jailing, death sentence, persecution en masse of demonstrators. And then, of course, the continued improvement and refinement of this big machine of censorship, the national internet. Go to the next one. All right, now, I love this. So part of my job as a media historian is I just collect stuff. And so this might not be kosher, I don't know, but I wanted to share it with you. So now we all know what happened with women, life, freedom. I would say, I'll just talk about the media tactics. You can go to the next one. So we have now, the prowess of the Iranian government to control things on the internet is now we've seen in action, right? 2002 featured just the ability to censorship rose, and it rose to granular levels, okay? The regime was able during these protests to block certain traffic. For example, the chat function of Discord, which is a gaming app but people use to talk and organize at this point, was disabled. You could still be on Discord, but you could not use the chat function. And in a throwback to 2009, the regime was able to block specific text messages that mentioned keywords, Amini, and other, incendiary words that the regime identified. Another thing we saw with this protest is the imposition of digital curfews. So you could not access non-NIN content hosted services at certain times, key times, 4 p.m. to midnight. And then, again, really extremely refined control of outages. So the Iranian government was able to block certain apps and certain traffic and confine those to a specific geographic area, even a specific town. And then this is something that I was interested as a media historian. There was this new kind of change in tactics on the symbolic level. It seems to me, and again, I would say this a little bit of data here, but a lot of observation and information as a scholar. It seems to me that the circulation of images of violence, of death, of rape, of a maiming of children, it seemed to me that there wasn't such a great hold on that. And I wonder if this was a changing of tactics to allow for more images of this to come out, more images and act to basically scare people, to project power, to tell people in Iran, look, this is what happens when you protest, when you resist, when you dissent, and this is what's going to happen. So it both projects regime power, the last elements of it, brute force, but also it's a symbol and a message to would-be protesters. Go to the next one. So again, after this, Iranian government is learning from these experiences. It improves and expands its cyber capabilities. It has better information operations. We've seen most recently information operations targeting the Israeli people and quite effectively. In the past, I've seen a lot of talk about information operations of the Iran and the Iranian government. I haven't been really impressed, but we've seen a new turn, a new level, new sophistication of operations. We've seen a commodification of internet go-arounds. So in the last 2022, VPNs didn't even work. That's the kind of control that the Iranian government has. But now you see, and actually I wouldn't say now, this has happened for a while, basically a VPN racket, where much of these VPNs are being sold by the IRGC. And then again, if you go to provinces outside Tehran, specifically minority provinces, you'll find sparse or no internet connectivity. It's just really hard to connect, let alone download or upload things. So I'm just going to add, you can go to the next one. So what's next from the crucible? What's the next protest? What is the government going to learn from the next protest? Well, we'll see the increasing refinement of this kind of internal security apparatus in cyber, the increased reliance on outside powers for this capability. We'll see brute force just winning the day. At the end of the day, violence wins, right? And then, this idea that image is key. And so I'm just going to say that, when we look at each of these protests, we can see Iran learning, right? It's learning how to better repress people. It's learning how to better weaken the population. It's learning how to better to survive. But we are learning too. And there's lessons we should take from these protests. And the lesson, I would say, the big lesson here is, we see this through the span of 15-year history, is that digitally networked media is a soft spot for this regime. It's a soft spot, it's a point of vulnerability. Iran, just to be quite frank, the leadership is very obsessed with image and the image it presents. And so we should do everything possible to exploit that weakness, that soft spot, because we need to do this to allow the people of Iran to realize freedom. And we, quite frankly, need to do it for our own national security interests also. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I would like to say that my panelists really understood the assignment and they've answered all my questions that I sent them earlier. So I am going to defer to the audience the questions, but I just want to add thank you, Dr. Blout, for explaining to me why, well, I knew I couldn't talk to my family in Iran through Telegram, and WhatsApp is every now and then. And I just want to say that there's now I know the strategy behind it, but also the fact that the Iranian people are so tech savvy, because they have to be, and resilient, and they find other avenues of communication constantly. So we have a lot of computer engineers in the making there. So thank you. And now I think we will have anybody who would like to ask a question in the audience, if they could go to the microphone. We have 25 minutes for questions. So if there's any time in between, we'll also have a moment for our presenters to be able to give any final notes that they would like at the end.
Hello, it's Will Ankers. I'm a senior here at USF. So my question is in regards to regime change, and I keep on hearing the word, and I also want Iran to be free. I honestly think that democracy is the best form of government. I can give you a long speech about why that is, but I'm struggling to think of an example of successful regime change where there was a long-term democratic transition. And I'm thinking of the three most successful democratic transitions, and they're not in the Middle East, but Spain, South Korea, and Taiwan. And in all three of those examples, there wasn't regime change. The ruling party was not overthrown, but instead there was internal reform. And I mean, some of these were really horrible regimes, but they slowly opened up and they slowly became more free. And I think a lot of that was because they were more connected with the world as a whole, and there wasn't sort of this maximal pressure put on them. And my question is, do you think there's a potential for something like that in Iran, or do you think there's a potential that we could change policy to be more friendly to Iran, and that the regime could be receptive to that? Yeah, thank you.
I think, so when you look at the history trajectory, at least the past 2-3 decades, after the revolution, immediately there was chaos, there was a decade of war, but then you see sort of an opening of the political space, and then with the first election of Mohammad Khatami, who was still a clergy, he was seen as part of the ruling power, but he was that's exactly what he was promising, reforms within the system, Islahat, literally called the era of Islahat. And he gets overwhelming support of the youth, of minorities, women. So essentially Iranians come to the poll to show that they're supporting this form of reform. Again, it's repeated, I'm just fast forwarding, when Hassan Rouhani, another viable candidate from within the regime, but as far as possible from the hardline core, which is the supreme leader and the rest of the hardliners within that structure, is allowed to run. Again, you see overwhelming support at the polls, essentially Iranians with their limited voting power showing that they want maximum change that the regime is allowing. And then with the rigging of elections and essentially elections becoming with the last presidential election becoming what Iranians see as meaningless, when any viable competition to the current president within that reformist or moderate structure is eliminated or disqualified. Essentially, this president is seen as a shoo-in candidate for which the field was cleared. He ran before and he didn't win, so this time the field was clear so he could win. Then you don't see that kind of support at the polls or the political participation. I think there's still if a lot of this depends on the regime. If they are willing to open up to allow for some form of a moderate or reformist faction or candidate to come back in, and we've seen that post-2009. It was a very dark and violent era, but then we saw a little bit of comeback where the reformists and the moderates were able to regroup, reconsolidate, and bring back or come back in the form of someone like Hassan Rouhani. A lot of this also has to do with regional dynamics, even global. Iran's the foreign policy sanctions, pressure, the war that's going in the region, all of that has serious impact on the domestic scene. So the answer to your question is I don't know. I'm hopeful that there would be more opening in the country. There have been ups and downs. There's been push and pull by that core, hardline, unelected, non-representative part of the regime, but we've seen also eras or times, brief moments sometimes, of opening. I think the society, I would say, still overwhelmingly would favor some form of a non-violent, without bloodshed change, but that's if the state or the regime allows that.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. That was an absolutely fantastic panel. Two questions. First, how much have the Russians and the Chinese helped Iran? This is for Emily, with their intranet. I seem to remember that the KGB gave a lot of advice to Khamenei in 2009 about how to crack down on those protests, and I assume that included the cyber dimension. And I had another question. Maybe start with that one, then I'll ask the other one.
Thank you for asking. You're totally right about Russia. So the national internet, NIN, was modeled aspirationally on the Chinese internet, which is it's a really good intranet as these things go. And it was conceived, thought of, and planned 20 years ahead of time. So China has the advantage of having domestic apps that everyone uses. It has its own internet with its own content, search engines, and so on. It has its own infrastructure and a really good and refined way to control and surveil its population. Not so much with Iran, especially in previous years, but still a little bit now. And so Iran needs Chinese know-how. It needs Chinese technology and training to get it to that next level. And the Chinese have really been integral to that process of growing this national internet.
The other question, this is maybe more for Negar, and that's about the media scene in Iran. We have seen, obviously, a tremendous contraction of media, but there are still some outlets which run pieces that are rather nuanced and surprising, not the sort of thing one would ever see in China or Russia these days. So I was just wondering for your reflections on that media environment. Also, we're still seeing the occasional viral video. There was one, we wrote about it at Stimson Center just the other week, of a woman, I believe in Isfahan. She was confronted by someone because she was at a clinic, she wasn't wearing hijab, and she screamed at this guy, and the video just went totally viral with lots of people obviously cheering her on for telling this guy, who are you to tell me what to wear, and so on. This stuff is still coming out. So what does that say? I mean, does that say that, as you point out, the women, life, freedom protests succeeded in a way? And also the ability of people to still get stuff out and post it on social media. I saw it on the former Twitter. Thanks.
Thanks, Barbara. So media, since the beginning of the Islamic Republic, broadcast media, especially television, is controlled and owned by the state. That's seen as the one outlet with the most impact, and it really does. Almost everyone in the country will be able to tune into the IRIB, the domestic broadcasting. So television, I would say, is the most tightly controlled to this day, and you can even see that in the image and how the anchors, the female anchors and male, have to dress, and even that has changed since the women, life, freedom movement, as a testament to how that movement has really sort of crippled into or brought this slow, gradual change, even when you see it on national television, sort of a relaxed or more lax enforcement of the hijab. You see more hair, you see more color, you see shorter dresses and things like that. Radio, less control, still a lot of state, but more channels. It's basically if you can't say it on television, you may be able to say it on radio and get away with it, because the assumption of the state is that not as many people will hear it at any given moment. And then newspaper is where independent media has existed. Essentially, there have been different eras. Right after Khatami election, in the reform era, there was a period where it was called the spring of the press, Bahar Matbuat, literally a blossoming of so many newspapers, reformist newspapers, and they were very radical, very critical. It led to the 1999 student protest. But to this day, I would say, because newspaper circulation is much smaller, and again, from the state's viewpoint, not as many people will see it or read it. So the obsession is still with television and also with satellite, diaspora television that beam into Iran, multiple channels, less on radio and less on newspaper. And now with internet, I think there's been a lot of democratization of that media and information space. No more the old guard, which is, and this is a global phenomena, but also in Iran. I was just talking to a journalist on the ground who told me these YouTube influencers or YouTube, sort of self-proclaimed journalists. They're not even necessarily journalists, but these YouTube personalities who have channels that would get a few, like tens of thousands of views, not even in a million, but they also have, this could be compared to like the circulation of a local newspaper. They would have their own interviews, sometimes very political, sometimes very radical. Someone was telling me this famous political figure said something on a YouTube channel that if he had been saying it on Voice of America or BBC, he would be arrested. He certainly wouldn't be able to say it on national television, but because it's seen as a smaller channel, the regime, I think, at some point has to let go of some of what they see these nuisances and focuses. The obsession is still on television and on the diaspora media, again, on the multiple television channels.
I would like to add something small, but we have to think about the age group that we're talking about too, because Gen Z is not watching the news, is not reading the newspaper, is not looking online for their news. They're getting their news from TikTok, they're getting their news from social media and from their friends. So the Gen Z that is a very active part of this most recent movement are communicating in mediums that the people abroad are communicating outside of Iran as well, and their network is much wider than we think. And I know that for me, I was watching videos during the movement on TikTok, and I'm like, wow, these young children, really, 16, 17-year-olds in Iran, communicating with people in the US. And it is very interesting to look at their own lived experience, their voices, and including that, where they're getting their information as well. Okay, we have, I think, if we can make it quick, 2 more questions. All right.
Hi, I'm Lucas Walters. I'm a junior here. So question for Dr. Blout. You talked about Iran embedding itself in U.S. infrastructure. I was hoping you could clarify, is that like simply a digital thing, or are we seeing that bridge the gap into more of the physical industrial control type systems? And is there a chance that we could see a Stuxnet sort of situation taking place either here in the States or with one of our allies in the region? Thank you.
So the answer is yes to all of that, except Stuxnet. I'm not convinced of cyber capability there, but I don't have access to the expertise in this room or the intelligence. So I can't, in an informed way, really talk about that. You said something about flex, though, and I want to talk about digital flex. This is maintaining the impression and possibly the capability to do these terrible things to our infrastructure, Israel's infrastructure, and so on. Maintaining that capability is kind of like proxy warfare, right? It creates flexibility, but it also sends signals to the outside world, great powers, that look, I have this capacity and I could use it. And so flex is a really important aspect of this.
And our last question.
Great. Thank you again. Another wonderful panel. I wanted to ask you a question about some of the economic realities that the Islamic Republic faces and whether that is going to have an impact on their views on women in society, gender policy. Since Islamic Republic was created in 1979, they sort of pursued this ideological vision. And we talked today about the axis of resistance, all the rest of it. But fundamentally, looked at from an economic point of view, that's all a drain. That is a cost for Iran. There are no benefits going back to Tehran. That's all a drain. So the Iranian regime right now is looking to increase revenue. One of the things, for example, they're doing is opening up Iran for tourism. So you got about 50 countries more that can now travel to Iran without a visa, including the Russians, the Chinese. Now, I mentioned those two countries specifically because I don't think either tourist groups from those countries likes the idea of mandatory hijab. In fact, we know the Russians complaining. That's why they go to Dubai or Turkey, not Iran. They've said it. The Russian ambassador has complained openly. We can't drink here, we don't come. My point is, economic realities. Do you see any kind of pressures that the regime might have to, out of economic necessity, say, because we know enforcement of hijab right now, if you look at YouTube videos, good parts of Tehran, it's not being enforced, right? Because they just don't have the resources to do it. Could they go further out of economic necessity without saying so in so many words, essentially stop enforcing it?
I can start. I think so, Alex. I think that's a great question. And it's not exactly comparable, but the closest I can think of is that ban on satellite dishes. So satellite dishes were banned, severe crackdowns. Security forces would literally go into people's buildings, go to the roof, break or confiscate dishes. But then it got to a point where there was you go to a high building in Tehran now, it's littered with satellite dishes everywhere. Universities need them, banks need them, government offices need them. So at some point, it was never declared that, oh, we failed. It was actually considered a war on satellite, that the foreigners are trying to infiltrate us politically, culturally, socially. This is a war on this infiltration. It was never publicly declared or acknowledged that that war failed, but I think slowly and gradually they just stopped enforcing that ban. And I think that's what's happening to the mandatory hijab. I don't think we'll see a public admission, acknowledgement that they failed or any form of actual, change on paper anytime soon as far as the law. But I think that lax enforcement will just continue because out of necessity, because that's what women and girls are pushing, and you can't put everyone in. They just don't have enough vans for the morality police. So I think so. I think the change is being enforced by the society.
Hope Chinese don't start providing electric vans to the Islamic Republic.
I actually, to your point about tourism, I heard an Iranian minister in that tourism industry specifically talk about how hijab laws should be more lax for Chinese tourists, like Chinese female tourists. So to that point, yes, exactly. And this is many years ago, yeah, in New York.
I have to add, since you all know I'm on TikTok, we're not supposed to be. There's a lot more videos mimicking the whole Habibi come to Dubai, Habibi come to Iran. I've seen this, and they're usually actually Russians. And they're showing, because there's a lot of beautiful historical sites, there's a lot of Airbnbs now of historical buildings that are now used to attract international people, specifically from the former Soviet Union states, as well as Iranians going back and forth to the Caucasus as well. So there's transportation both ways. But I do think that looking at social media kind of is a good lens for us to see what's happening on the ground. Okay, so we're gonna wrap it up. If anybody has any last point, we did it. And you all did it as well, so congratulations.